Jake had lived in isolation for many years, ever since he left behind the noise and bustle of town life. His ranch, tucked deep into the mountains, was his refuge, the place where he could escape from the world and live on his own terms. It wasn't a large ranch, but it was enough to keep him busy. He took care of his cattle, mended fences, and worked the land with his own two hands. The air was always fresh, the skies always clear, and the only sounds were those of the wind and the animals. Each morning, Jake woke up before the sun. The rooster crowed, and the first light of day peeked over the hills. He made his way to the barn where he fed the animals and tended to their needs. There was something about the rhythm of his daily routine that brought him peace. He didn't have to think too much. The work kept him busy and his mind occupied, a distraction from the pain he carried deep inside. Jake had a past, one he didn't like to talk about. His wife Sarah had passed away several years ago, and with her his hopes for a happy future. After her death, the ranch became his world. It was easier to work the land than to face the emotions that swirled inside of him. He didn't have family to go back to, and his friends had all moved on with their lives. So he stayed on the ranch alone with only the animals for company. At first, the solitude had been a relief. There were no reminders of his past, no places where he might run into someone who might ask about her. But over time, the quiet became suffocating. The empty spaces in the house echoed with the sound of memories. The empty chair at the dinner table was a reminder that something was missing. Even the endless days of work couldn't fill the emptiness in his heart. Jake tried to keep busy. He spent long hours in the fields, fixing the fences, checking on the crops, and making sure the animals were well taken care of. He learned to live with the loneliness, telling himself that it was just the way things were now. But there were nights when the silence was too much to bear. He would sit by the fire, staring into the flames, lost in thought. What was the point of it all? What was he working for? He had no one to share it with, no one to enjoy the fruits of his labor. As the days passed, Jake began to wonder if this was all there was to life. Would he spend the rest of his years on the ranch working alone day after day? The thought weighed heavily on him, but he didn't know what else to do. The world outside the ranch seemed so far away, so out of reach. It was easier to stay where he was, to keep things simple and familiar. He didn't have to face the outside world, and that was comforting in a way. But deep down, Jake knew that something was missing. He longed for connection, for companionship, but he didn't know how to find it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with shades of orange and pink, Jake sat on the porch, his boots resting on the wooden steps. He had finished his work for the day, but the quiet still hung in the air, as if the world was holding its breath. He thought about his life, about the choices he had made, and about the years he had spent alone. He had never been one to regret the past, but sometimes he couldn't help but wonder what might have been different. He stared out at the vast, open land that stretched for miles in every direction. There was beauty in the isolation, in the stillness of the world around him, but there was also a sense of emptiness, a feeling that something was lacking. He wasn't sure what he wanted, but he knew he couldn't keep living this way forever. Jake had always prided himself on being independent. He didn't need anyone, or so he told himself. But there were moments, like tonight, when the silence was deafening. He thought about what it would be like to have someone to talk to, someone to share the small moments of life with. He thought about how nice it would be to laugh again, to have someone to sit next to on the porch as the evening sun set. But those thoughts quickly faded, replaced by the harsh reality of his isolation. The next few days passed in much the same way. Jake worked from dawn until dusk, his routine unchanging. He didn't expect anything to change. He had come to terms with his solitary life, or so he thought. But then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. As Jake was walking back to the barn after checking on the cattle, he heard the sound of horses approaching. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him. But as the sound grew louder, he stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. He had not seen anyone for miles, and the thought of someone coming to the ranch was enough to stop him cold. He turned around, his eyes scanning the horizon. And then he saw them. 3 women on horseback were riding toward the ranch. Their figures were outlined against the setting sun, and for a moment Jake thought he was imagining it. But as they drew closer, he realized they were real. His mind raced, wondering who they were and what they were doing here. He hadn't expected any visitors, let alone 3 women. As they neared the ranch gate, Jake could see that they were tired. Their clothes were dusty from travel and their faces were lined with exhaustion. The leader of the group, a woman with dark hair and a commanding presence, raised a hand in greeting. "Hello there," she called out. "We're looking for a place to rest for a while. Do you mind if we stay?" Jake didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to strangers showing up at his ranch, but something in their eyes, something in the way they carried themselves told him they weren't just ordinary travelers. They had a purpose, a reason for being here. After a long pause, Jake finally spoke. "You can stay for a while," he said, his voice low. "I've got plenty of room." As the women dismounted and made their way toward the house, Jake felt a sense of unease wash over him. This wasn't the life he was used to. He was a man who valued his space, his quiet, but for some reason he couldn't bring himself to send them away. The women introduced themselves, Lily, Sarah, and Emma, and explained that they had been traveling for days, looking for a place to rest. They didn't say much else, but Jake could tell they were grateful for the shelter. He showed them to the guest room where they could clean up and relax. That night, as Jake sat by the fire, he couldn't help but wonder what this all meant. 3 women had just shown up at his ranch, and he had invited them in without a second thought. What was going on? Why had they come here? He wasn't sure, but for the first time in a long while he felt a spark of curiosity, a hope that maybe, just maybe, his life was about to change. Jake woke up early the next morning, as he always did. The rooster's crow pierced the quiet air, and the sun had barely risen over the horizon. He stretched his arms above his head, feeling the stiffness in his bones from a long day's work yesterday. The sound of his boots against the wooden floor echoed in the empty house as he made his way downstairs. But this morning, something was different. There were voices. Quiet, but there. He hadn't heard voices in the house in years. And the realization caught him off guard. Lily, Sarah, and Emma were sitting around the kitchen table, their tired faces now softened with the warmth of the morning light. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and for a moment Jake forgot about his routine, about the lonely silence he had lived with for so long. He watched them from the doorway, unsure of what to say. The women seemed so comfortable in his space, as if they belonged there. "Good morning," Lily greeted him, her voice kind but strong. There was an ease to her manner that put Jake at ease, though he wasn't used to feeling that way. He nodded in return. "Morning." His voice was hoarse from sleep, but it was all he could muster at that moment. The women were already making themselves at home, setting the table and preparing breakfast. Emma, with her bright, adventurous spirit, had already gathered eggs from the chickens in the yard. Sarah, the quiet one, was slicing some bread to toast. It was a small, simple scene, but to Jake it was foreign. For so long it had just been him and the animals. Now there were people, real people, in his house, making the place feel more like a home than it ever had before. As they sat down to eat, Jake noticed that the women didn't seem like strangers anymore. Their stories from the night before had left him with a sense of understanding about them, though he still didn't know all the details. They hadn't said much about why they were traveling, but he could tell they weren't just out for adventure. They were running from something, maybe not all of them, but there was a heaviness in their eyes that suggested more than just a need for a roof over their heads. Jake tried to push the thought aside as he took a bite of his food. He wasn't in the habit of asking personal questions, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear their stories yet. But the more he watched them interact, the more he felt a connection to each of them. They were strong, resilient women who had survived their own hardships. In a way, they reminded him of himself when he had first come to the ranch, alone, trying to make sense of a world that had turned upside down. As the day wore on, Jake showed them around the property. It wasn't much to look at, just a few acres of land, some fields, and a handful of cattle, but it was his pride and joy. He had built the ranch from the ground up, and it had kept him busy and grounded over the years. He took the women to the barn, where he kept the tools and feed for the animals. He showed them the small garden he had started, though it was mostly weeds now, and he led them to the pasture where the cattle grazed, explaining how he managed the herd and kept them in good shape. The women listened intently, asking questions about the land and how Jake had managed it all on his own. They were genuinely interested, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like his work mattered. He wasn't just some lonely rancher living in the middle of nowhere. He was someone who had built something with his own hands. And maybe, Just maybe the women could see that too. By the time they had finished the tour, the sun was beginning to set. It was a beautiful evening, with the sky painted in shades of purple and orange. The air had a crispness to it that Jake had always loved, the kind that made you feel alive, made you feel like anything was possible. He stood on the porch looking out at the landscape that had been his world for so long. It had always been enough for him, but now with the women here he wasn't so sure. As they all sat down to dinner that night, Jake found himself listening more than speaking. Lily, Sarah, and Emma had begun to open up a little more, telling stories of their travels and the places they had been. It was clear that they had all seen their share of struggle, but they had also found strength in each other. They laughed together, a sound that Jake hadn't heard in years, and he couldn't help but smile. He felt the warmth of their presence, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a little less alone. The conversation shifted, and Jake found himself sharing more than he had intended. He talked about Sarah, his wife, and the life they had shared before her passing. He told them how he had come to the ranch to escape his grief, to find a place where he could heal. But healing, it seemed, was a long and lonely road. He hadn't expected to find it here with these 3 women who had arrived out of nowhere. But somehow their presence made him feel like maybe, just maybe, healing wasn't something he had to do alone. As the night grew darker, Jake realized that he wasn't ready for the women to leave. He hadn't expected them to stay forever, but there was something about their company that made the ranch feel less like a prison and more like a home. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a sense of peace in their presence, something he hadn't felt in years. He walked outside later that evening, stepping onto the porch to breathe in the cool night air. The stars above were bright and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow over the land. He leaned against the wooden railing, his thoughts swirling. He had spent so many years in solitude, convincing himself that he didn't need anyone. But now with the women here, he was starting to wonder if he had been wrong. Jake didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was open to the idea of change. He didn't have to be alone. Maybe, just maybe, these women would be the ones to show him that life on the ranch didn't have to be so solitary. Maybe they would bring something into his life that he never thought possible. Friendship, companionship, and even love. Whatever it was, Jake knew one thing for certain. Things were never going to be the same again. The next few days passed in a way Jake had never experienced before. With the 3 women on the ranch, his life felt different, though he wasn't sure exactly how. It wasn't just their presence that changed things, it was their energy, their willingness to pitch in, and the way they made him feel less isolated. It had been a long time since Jake had allowed anyone into his world, and now that they were here, it seemed the walls he had built up around himself were starting to crumble. Each morning, the women would wake early, much like Jake. They worked alongside him, feeding the animals, tending to the garden, and taking care of the house. They each brought something different to the table. Lily had a natural way with the animals, her calm demeanor making the cows and horses respond to her with ease. She would often spend hours in the barn, talking softly to the animals as she cleaned out their stalls or fed them. Sarah, though quieter, was incredibly practical and organized. She helped Jake with the bookkeeping, making sure the supplies were in order and offering ideas on how to make things more efficient. Emma was the adventurous spirit of the group. She loved exploring the land and would often bring back wildflowers or herbs she had found on her walks. She would also pitch in with the hard labor, fixing fences or carrying heavy loads with a strength that surprised Jake. Jake, for the first time in years, felt the rhythm of the ranch change. It wasn't just him and his tasks anymore. There was laughter in the kitchen as the women prepared meals, and even the animals seemed livelier with the attention they received. Jake couldn't deny that he had grown accustomed to their presence. In fact, he found himself looking forward to the small moments, the shared meals, the conversations by the fire, the way the women helped him in ways he hadn't expected. Lily, with her nurturing nature, often took the time to sit with Jake after a long day. They would sit on the porch watching the sunset behind the hills. It became a routine of sorts, one that Jake didn't realize he had missed until it started. He would talk about his past, about Sarah, and about why he had chosen to live alone. Lily listened quietly, never interrupting, just offering a word of encouragement when needed. She didn't judge him or push him to talk more than he was comfortable with. Her presence was comforting like a soft blanket in the cold. One evening, after a particularly hard day of work, Jake was sitting by the fire. The warmth from the flames making the chill of the night air seem less harsh. Sarah came to sit beside him, her quiet demeanor always offering a sense of calm. She had been busy all day, organizing supplies and making sure everything on the ranch was running smoothly. She was a woman of few words, but when she spoke, it always seemed to carry weight. "Jake," she said softly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "You've built something special here." Jake looked at her, unsure of what she meant. "I've just been doing what I can to get by," he replied, his voice low. Sarah shook her head, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "No, it's more than that. You've created a place where people can live and grow, a place that's safe and peaceful. You've worked hard for everything here." Jake felt a warmth spread through him, but it wasn't just from the fire. For the first time, he realized that what he had done on this ranch wasn't just about survival. He had built something lasting, something that could provide not only for him but for others as well. He had spent so long thinking of his isolation as a necessity, but now he could see that it had been a choice, one that kept him from opening up to others. The women had shown him that there was more to life than just work and solitude. Emma, always full of life, joined them around the fire a little later. She was laughing, her carefree nature lighting up the evening. "You should see what I found today," she exclaimed. She held up a bundle of wildflowers, their vibrant colors contrasting with the darkening sky. Jake smiled, genuinely amused by Emma's enthusiasm. She had a way of making even the simplest things feel important. "Where'd you find those?" he asked, intrigued by her excitement. "Just a little further down the creek," Emma said, her eyes sparkling with the joy of discovery. "I thought they'd brighten up the kitchen." As Emma carefully arranged the flowers in a vase, Jake watched her with a sense of gratitude. It was clear that the women weren't just here to pass the time. They were making this ranch feel more alive, more like a place that had a future. It wasn't just a home for him anymore. It was a home for all of them. As the days turned into weeks, Jake found himself feeling more at ease with the women. He no longer felt like an outsider in his own home. There was a sense of belonging that had slowly begun to take root. But with that sense of belonging came a new challenge. Jake had never learned how to open up to people. He had kept his distance for so long that it felt foreign to him to let anyone in. Yet the women had shown him kindness and understanding, and as time passed, he found himself starting to trust them. One evening after dinner, Lily asked him a question that made him pause. "Jake," she began gently, "why did you choose to live here alone for so long?" The question hung in the air and Jake hesitated. He had never really thought about it. His decision to isolate himself had been a slow one, a gradual process of retreating from the world. "I guess I just needed space," he said finally. "I lost my wife and I didn't know how to keep going without her. This place, it was the only thing that felt right." Lily nodded, her eyes softening with understanding. "Sometimes it's easier to hide from the world than face the pain," she said quietly. "But you don't have to be alone anymore, Jake." Her words echoed in his mind long after the conversation had ended. He had spent so many years convinced that solitude was the answer to his grief, but now he wasn't so sure. The women had come into his life unexpectedly, and in their own way they had begun to heal him, showing him that there was still life to be lived. Even after loss, as Jake lay in bed that night, he thought about all that had changed in such a short time. His life, once defined by loneliness and routine, was now filled with laughter, companionship, and a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in years. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face it alone. The days seemed to stretch out in a way that felt new to Jake. The small changes that had begun to take root on the ranch now seemed to multiply each day. Every corner of the property, every little task felt lighter, as if the weight that had once pressed on his shoulders was being slowly lifted by the simple acts of living with others. The presence of Lily, Sarah, and Emma had turned the place into something different, a home. Jake found himself growing more comfortable in their company, but it also stirred up feelings he wasn't prepared for. There was something about their presence that made him long for connection, but at the same time it made him cautious. He didn't want to get too attached, afraid that when they left, the emptiness would return. But each time one of the women smiled at him, or shared a laugh around the dinner table. He couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. One evening, after a long day of working in the fields, Jake sat down at the dinner table, feeling the familiar tension in his chest. The meal was simple: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and vegetables from the garden. The women were already talking, their voices filled with ease and comfort. It was the kind of conversation that Jake hadn't experienced in years, and it was hard for him to ignore how much it had come to mean to him. Lily, with her gentle nature, was asking Sarah about her past. Sarah had been quiet about her life before the ranch, but over the last few days she had begun to open up more. She spoke about losing her family in a fire, how she had wandered for years, never quite feeling settled. "I've always been moving," she said, "never staying in one place long enough to make a home." Jake watched Sarah as she spoke, the vulnerability in her voice catching him off guard. He had never imagined that someone like her, someone so strong and capable, had experienced such hardship. It reminded him that they all had stories, stories that shaped who they were. "It's different here," Sarah continued, her eyes meeting Jake's across the table. "This place, it's healing. It feels like it could be the place where I finally stop running." Jake didn't know how to respond. The weight of her words sat heavy in the air. He wasn't used to being the one who provided that kind of sanctuary. Yet here they were, 3 women, each with their own struggles and stories, finding something in the ranch that they had never expected. Lily reached out and placed a hand on Sarah's arm. "We've all been through a lot," she said softly, "but we're here now together, and that makes a difference." Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. It felt like everything had shifted in that moment, as though he was no longer just a man living alone on a ranch. He was part of something, a small, quiet community that had formed unexpectedly. And for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider in his own home. But even as the days passed and the 4 of them settled into a rhythm, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The women had been staying for several weeks now, and though they had made it clear that they were grateful for the shelter, Jake couldn't help but wonder if they were growing restless. He had learned that they had no real place to go, no other home to return to, but he could see the way they looked at the horizon sometimes, as if they were waiting for something to call them away. One afternoon, while Jake was working in the garden, Emma approached him. She had a way of moving that was different from the others, quick, purposeful, always with an energy that seemed to bounce off her. She was carrying a basket of herbs she had gathered from the creek, and she smiled as she walked toward him. "I was thinking," she began, "we've been here for a while now. It's been good, right? But, well, we don't want to overstay our welcome." Jake's heart sank at her words. He hadn't expected it to come up so soon, but part of him had been dreading this conversation. He didn't want them to leave, but he also didn't want to push them to stay out of fear of being alone again. "You're not overstepping," Jake said quickly, his voice a little rougher than he intended. I'm glad you're here, but if you need to leave, you're free to do so whenever you want." Emma gave him a sharp look as if she wasn't sure whether he was telling the truth. She paused for a moment, letting the words settle in the air. "I'm not saying we're leaving," she replied finally, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "But we're not sure what comes next, you know." Jake didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure himself. The ranch had become more than just a place for him to hide away. It had become a place of connection, of shared experiences. He wasn't ready to let that go. That night, as they gathered around the fire, Jake couldn't help but think about Emma's words. He had spent so long hiding from the world, living in the quiet of his own pain, that he hadn't realized how much he had come to rely on the company of others. Lily, Sarah, and Emma had brought something into his life that he hadn't known he was missing: hope, companionship, and a sense of belonging. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all walking on borrowed time. As the fire crackled and the stars above began to shine, Jake realized something. He had let these women into his life because, for the first time in years, he trusted them. He trusted them not to run away from him, not to judge him, but to be part of something real. He didn't want to let that go. Lily, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice calm but steady. "Jake," she said, "we're not here to be a burden. We're here because we see something in you. We see a man who has a lot to give, and we want to be part of that. But we also understand that you're not used to this. You don't have to keep us here if you don't want us. But if you do, well, we're not going anywhere anytime soon." Jake turned to face her, the firelight casting shadows across her face. She had a way of looking at him that made him feel seen, really seen, in a way that no one had ever looked at him before. She wasn't asking for anything from him, except maybe to be a part of his life. And for the first time in a long time, Jake found himself wanting that too. "I don't want you to leave," Jake said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Lily smiled, her eyes warm and understanding. "Then we'll stay," she said simply. And just like that, Jake realized something. It wasn't the house or the land that made the ranch a home. It was the people who shared it with him. And for the first time, Jake felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The days began to blend together, the way they always did in the quiet rhythms of the ranch. The sun rose and set, the animals were tended to, and the chores were completed. But now the quiet was no longer oppressive. It was filled with the hum of life, of people working together. Jake had never realized how much he had missed the simple act of sharing a space with others. It had taken 3 women, strangers at first, to make him see what he had been missing for so long. The mornings were still early, but now they were filled with laughter as the women prepared breakfast. The barn, which had once felt like a place of solitude, now echoed with voices as the animals were fed and cared for. Even the small garden Jake had started was thriving with their help. The land, which had once seemed so vast and empty, now felt full of potential, full of life. One evening, as they sat around the fire, Jake found himself thinking about how far they had all come since that first day the women arrived. It felt like a lifetime ago, and yet it had only been a few weeks. In those few weeks, the ranch had become something different. It had become a place where people not only worked but shared stories, laughter, and moments of quiet togetherness. Lily had spent many nights talking with Jake, sharing stories of her past, of her travels, and of the hardships she had faced. Her words were always gentle and her presence calm. It was as if she had lived a life of many challenges, but had learned to carry them with grace. Jake found himself drawn to her strength, to the way she seemed to find peace in the middle of turmoil. Sarah, too, had begun to open up. Her past had been filled with loss and pain, but as the days passed, it became clear that the ranch was a place of healing for her. She no longer wore the guarded expression she had worn when she first arrived. Instead, she had started to smile more, to join in the conversations, to share in the small moments of joy that life brought. Emma, with her boundless energy and adventurous spirit, had a way of making even the most mundane tasks feel like an adventure. She had a way of looking at the world as if everything was an opportunity to explore, to discover something new. Jake admired her for that, for her ability to bring life into everything she touched. She was the spark, the one who reminded them all that life was more than just work and survival. It was about living, truly living. As the days passed, Jake found himself starting to look forward to the future, something he hadn't done in years. He had spent so much time looking backward, dwelling on his past, that he had forgotten how to look ahead. But with the women on the ranch, he was beginning to see a future that was full of possibilities. A future where the land wasn't just a place of survival, but a place of growth, of community, of connection. One afternoon, Jake took a walk around the ranch, the crisp air biting at his skin as he walked. He paused by the old oak tree that stood at the edge of the property, its branches bare against the winter sky. This tree had been here long before Jake had arrived, and in many ways, it felt like a symbol of his life, the way he had once stood alone, rooted to the land but cut off from everything else. He leaned against the tree, closing his eyes for a moment and letting the wind wash over him. It was peaceful, this quiet, but there was something different about it now. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was filled with meaning, with life. The sound of footsteps approached, and Jake turned to see Lily walking toward him. She smiled, her eyes soft and understanding. "You seem lost in thought," she said. Jake chuckled softly. "I guess I am. Just thinking about how much has changed since you all got here." Lily leaned against the tree next to him, her gaze turning toward the horizon. "It's funny," she said, her voice thoughtful, "how quickly we can adjust, how easily a person can fall into a routine even when they're not sure they want to." Jake nodded. "Yeah. I never thought I'd let anyone in, let alone 3 women." He paused, looking down at the ground, his voice quieter now. "I've spent so many years alone, I forgot what it felt like to be part of something." Lily turned to face him, her expression gentle. You don't have to be alone anymore, Jake. You've built something here, something real. You've made a place where people can find peace, where they can grow. Jake looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. It was true. The ranch had always been a place of isolation for him, but now it was a place of connection. It was a place where people could find comfort, could heal, could build something together. And he was starting to see that he didn't have to do it all alone. Over the next few days, the conversations continued. Jake, Lily, Sarah, and Emma talked about the future, about what they wanted, about what they could build together. The more they talked, the more Jake realized that the women had become an integral part of his life. They weren't just passing through. They were becoming part of his story, part of his future. The decision to stay wasn't easy for any of them. Each woman had her own reasons for coming to the ranch, and each had her own dreams of where she wanted to go. But they had all come to realize that for now this place, this ranch, was where they needed to be. And so they made a pact, not just to stay, but to build something together. They would continue working the land, caring for the animals, and making the ranch a place where they could all thrive. That night, as they gathered around the fire once more, Jake felt a sense of peace that he had never known before. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from silence, from being alone. It was a peace that came from connection, from sharing life with others, from knowing that they were all in this together. As the fire crackled and the stars above twinkled brightly in the sky, Jake felt something shift inside him. He was no longer just the lonely rancher on the edge of the world. He was part of something bigger now, something that was growing, something that was alive with possibility. And for the first time in years, Jake allowed himself to believe in the future. He didn't know what it would hold, but he knew one thing. It would be better than what had come before. Because now he had people beside him, and that made all the difference in the world.